Hello, my name is Don Edwards. I'm the worldwide tech leader for identity at Amazon Web Services. In this video, I will show you the end-to-end configuration steps for giving your developers access to Amazon CodeWhisperer Professional using Microsoft Entra ID and AWS IAM Identity Center. I will begin by giving you a brief introduction to the two AWS components I will be working with, Amazon CodeWhisperer and AWS IAM Identity Center. Next, I will give you a high-level overview of the AWS account structure I'm working with, as well as the steps involved in connecting the components. Then, I will demonstrate the end-to-end configuration process. Finally, I will give you some resources you can use to get started working with CodeWhisperer on your own. First, let's introduce Amazon CodeWhisperer. CodeWhisperer is a machine learning-driven service that integrates directly into a developer's favorite development tools. CodeWhisperer makes context-driven suggestions that can accelerate application development and free up developers to focus on application functionality instead of language mechanics and syntax. As CodeWhisperer makes suggestions, it detects when the suggestion may be similar to particular open-source training data and can mark it with repository and licensing information. CodeWhisperer also can scan your code for security vulnerabilities, AWS security standards, best practices, and more. During the CodeWhisperer preview, we ran a productivity challenge, and participants who used Amazon CodeWhisperer were 27% more likely to complete tasks successfully, and did so an average of 57% faster than those who did not use CodeWhisperer. The professional tier of Amazon CodeWhisperer is integrated with AWS IAM Identity Center for access provisioning. We created Identity Center to be the front door to your organization, centralizing workforce identity and access management as your organization grows to hundreds or even thousands of AWS accounts, while still giving you fine-grained control over who can access your accounts, applications, and resources. Identity Center can be deployed alongside your existing identity and access management solutions with no impact to how your users work with AWS accounts today. Let's take a quick look at the authentication flow that your developers will experience once they have CodeWhisperer, Identity Center, and Entra ID fully integrated. Most developers today use some kind of integrated development environment, or IDE, while writing code. Amazon CodeWhisperer supports several IDEs, like Visual Studio Code, JetBrains, and our very own web-based IDE, AWS Cloud 9. The IDE I am using today is Visual Studio Code. AWS provides a CodeWhisperer plugin to Visual Studio Code as part of the AWS Toolkit extension, which also includes support for Amazon Code Catalyst, AWS Lambda, and other AWS services. After setting up the CodeWhisperer plugin to work with Identity Center, a developer's IDE will automatically open a browser for authentication through Entra ID, which authorizes the CodeWhisperer session through Identity Center. Once they are authenticated, the developer is up and running with their IDE ready to write code. Now, before we jump into the configuration steps, let's take a look at the multi-account AWS environment I'm using and talk about some of the best practices for configuring IAM Identity Center and CodeWhisperer. AWS recommends that all customers going forward segment their workloads and resources into multiple AWS accounts grouped together according to purpose, phase of development, and other categories useful for governance. Using multiple AWS accounts to help isolate and manage your business applications and data can help you optimize across most of the AWS Well-Architected pillars, including operational excellence, security, reliability, and cost optimization. This is a representation of the multi-account structure built out in my demo environment. While the full topic of designing your multi-account structure is outside the scope of this video, I do want to highlight one important best practice for working with Identity Center: delegating administration to a dedicated identity management AWS account. Let's focus on the two AWS accounts that will be involved in configuring access to CodeWhisperer: the top-level organization management account and a dedicated account for identity management functions. Since IAM Identity Center is designed to provision workforce access to all of the accounts in an AWS organization, it must first be enabled in the organization management account. The management account contains some of the most sensitive configurations and governance functions in your environment, so you really want to limit the number of people who can access it. To that end, the first thing we will do after enabling Identity Center in the organization management account is to delegate administration to the identity management account. All further configuration will happen there. Next, we will configure Identity Center to use Microsoft Entra ID as its identity provider. The first step is to establish a SAML trust relationship between the two by exchanging certificates and other configuration data. Then, we will enable Entra ID to push user and group information to Identity Center for use in access provisioning. Once users and groups have had a chance to populate in Identity Center, we will set up CodeWhisperer in the same account and assign permissions to the users who are likely to be writing code. Now that you have a high-level idea of the configuration steps, let's jump right into the demonstration. Our first task is to enable Identity Center. To do that, we'll log into the organization management account with a user that has permissions to set up Identity Center. Always remember to have multi-factor authentication enabled for any user that has administrative rights. Once I'm in the management account, I'll go into Identity Center and click Enable. This brings us to the Identity Center dashboard. Now that we have Identity Center enabled in the organization management account, we'll go to the Settings menu, which is where you can find the option to delegate administration to another account in your organization. Navigate to the Management tab, and there you can see the Delegated Administrator option. Click Register Account, and this gives you a view of the accounts in your organization. I have grouped the accounts in my organization according to the best practices laid out in the white paper, Organizing Your AWS Environment Using Multiple Accounts. I'll provide a link to that white paper in the show notes. The dedicated account I created for identity management falls under the infrastructure and production OUs in my organization. Now that I have selected the account, I'll scroll down to the bottom and click Register Account. Now that we have done the initial configuration of Identity Center, we can configure it to use Entra ID as its external identity provider. To do that, we will log out of the organization management account and log into the identity management account, again with a user that has permissions to configure Identity Center. Again, here is the Identity Center dashboard. To set up an external identity provider, we'll select Choose Your Identity Source. That brings us back to the settings screen, where when you scroll down, you can see that the identity source is currently Identity Center's native directory store. Since we want to use an external identity provider, we'll go to the Actions dropdown and select Change Identity Source. This gives us three options. Since we are using an external identity provider, we will select External Identity Provider. As we mentioned before, using an external identity provider requires that we set up a SAML trust relationship between Identity Center and the external identity provider. This screen gives you all the information you need to establish that trust. Since we will need to exchange several different configuration items between Identity Center and the external identity provider, it helps to copy all the configuration items into a text document. You can see also the same page is used to configure Identity Center with configuration items that we will get from Entra ID. Now, let's switch over to Entra ID. You can see that I have 10 users already defined in my Entra ID directory. These 10 users are grouped into 5 different groups. We'll take a look at those later. To set up the Entra ID side of the trust relationship, we'll go into the Entra ID Active Directory. Entra ID thinks of Identity Center as being an application. So we'll click on App Registrations, click on All Applications, and then click New Registration. Instead of configuring everything by hand, we will select a pre-configured template out of Enterprise Applications. Click New Application. And because we want to federate with Identity Center, not with a single account, we will search for Application and enter Identity Center. Select Identity Center and click Create. Now we'll set up the trust relationship. We'll click Single Sign-On. Identity Center uses SAML to federate with Entra ID, so we'll select SAML. And in the basic SAML configuration section, we'll click Edit. Here we can click Add Identifier. The identifier Entra ID is looking for is the issuer URL from Identity Center. Then we click Add Reply URL, which is what Entra ID calls the ACS URL from Identity Center. Now we click Save. And scroll down to the SAML Certificates section. Here we need to download the certificate that Identity Center will use to establish the trust relationship with Entra ID. Be sure to download the base64 encoded version of the certificate. Also, we need to copy two URLs, the login URL and the identifier URL. This is what Entra ID calls the issuer URL that Identity Center expects. Now we'll switch back over to Identity Center. Identity Center needs the sign-in URL, and the issuer URL. As well as the certificate that we downloaded. Scroll down to the bottom and click Next. Make sure that you review the consequences of the changes you're making by changing your identity source. Type Accept to confirm that you understand the consequences, and click Change Identity Source. Now that we have the trust relationship established between Entra ID and Identity Center, we need to enable automatic provisioning of user and group information from Entra ID to Identity Center. To do that, we click Enable on Automatic Provisioning. Identity Center uses an open standard protocol called System for Cross-Domain Identity Management, or SCIM for short, to automate exchange of user identity information from the identity provider. To do that, Entra ID needs some additional configuration items: the SCIM endpoint and the access token it uses to authenticate. Be sure to include the trailing /. Next, we will show the access token and copy it to the clipboard. This access token gives Entra ID privileged access into Identity Center, so we will not paste it into the text document, but instead we'll go directly back over to Entra ID and enter it into the configuration there. Select the provisioning menu item on the left. Then click Get Started, and select Automatic Provisioning Mode. Then, paste in the secret token, and copy the SCIM endpoint URL, and paste it into the tenant URL field. Now test the connection and click Save. And now Entra ID has everything it needs to replicate users and groups to Identity Center. Click Start Provisioning, After waiting a short period of time for the replication to occur, we can go back to Identity Center click Refresh on Groups, and we can see that the groups of users have been replicated over. CodeWhisperer is an authenticated service, and some development teams may want an extended session length so they aren't required to re-authenticate every few hours. Session duration for CodeWhisperer is affected by both the maximum session length within Identity Center and the maximum session length within your identity provider. To configure session duration in Identity Center, go to the Settings tab, click on Authentication, and click Configure. The default duration is 8 hours, but it can be extended to as long as 7 days. Now that we have Identity Center and the external identity provider completely configured, we can set up CodeWhisperer. To do that, we log into the Identity Management account. CodeWhisperer must be set up in the same account as Identity Center. You can find CodeWhisperer under the Developer Tools Services list. Click Get Started, and CodeWhisperer shows you all the users and groups defined in Identity Center. Now that Identity Center is set up with its identity source, I'm granting the AWS Developers Group access to CodeWhisperer. As we scroll down, you can see pricing and cost estimates, as well as some advanced configuration settings. Click Set up CodeWhisperer, and my developers now have access. Now I can switch over to my development environment. As I mentioned before, I'm using Visual Studio Code for this demo. The plugin for Visual Studio is included in the AWS Toolkit extension, so I'll navigate to Extensions, search for CodeWhisperer, and click Install on the AWS Toolkit. After it's installed, I'll click on the AWS icon that appears. Click Connect to AWS to get started, and click on CodeWhisperer. When I scroll down, I have two authentication options, AWS Builder ID and the one I'll use today, IAM Identity Center. The CodeWhisperer plugin needs to know the Identity Center starting URL, which we copied to the text file during our configuration. Enter the starting URL, select the region where we configured CodeWhisperer, and click Sign In. The CodeWhisperer plugin generates an authorization code that we need to copy and enter into the authorization screen. Paste the code, click Next. And the browser is redirected to Entra ID. We'll log in as one of the members of the AWS_developers group. And click Allow Access. When we go back to Visual Studio Code, it confirms that CodeWhisperer is completely set up. Now we'll create a new Python file. and give a sample of what CodeWhisperer can do. When I start to define a Python function for parsing a comma-separated value file, CodeWhisperer starts making suggestions on how to write the body of that function. I'm not typing anything here. I'm simply accepting the recommendations that CodeWhisperer gives me. Understand that these are only suggestions, and the developer is still responsible for making sure that the code is effective and secure. Now that you have a feel for the process of setting up access to CodeWhisperer Professional, let me point you to some resources that can help you put into practice what you have learned. First, I would encourage you to dive into the features and benefits of using Amazon CodeWhisperer. The leftmost QR code will take you directly to the resources you need to get hands-on with CodeWhisperer quickly. The middle QR code will take you to a self-paced workshop that walks you through some examples of getting the most out of CodeWhisperer's suggestion engine. The QR code on the right leads to a YouTube video that walks you through creating your first app with CodeWhisperer. In this video, I introduced you to Amazon CodeWhisperer Professional, AWS IAM Identity Center, and Microsoft Entra ID. We walked through the architecture and workflow of how those three services work together to get your developers up and running quickly with CodeWhisperer's code suggestion and analysis tools. Then I demonstrated all of the steps needed for the end-to-end configuration of CodeWhisperer, Identity Center, and Entra ID. Thank you for watching, and I wish you the best in your journey with CodeWhisperer.